Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and professional growth and opportunity across America. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Today we've got a great episode with Barry Richards on Sidebar. And Barry, I just wanted to welcome you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Troy. It's another honor to be here.
Yeah, we're going to have a good discussion today.
As we always do. Yeah.
Hey, Barry. So I was thinking a lot about, AI lately.
Yeah.
So a couple weeks ago, I was in Orlando within IBM. We've been really focusing on transforming the consulting industry towards what they say as asset-based consulting, which is infusing AI into everything we do to kind of restructure, help reorganize the technology basis for companies. For people out there, we've talked about this, but, you're a pretty senior technology guy at Southern California Edison, and you've been in the technology business for a long time. And that's how we really met each other.
That's right. And
I was kind of curious just to get your perspective on maybe two things, and maybe we'll break this up into two episodes. We always hear that there's two or three really big problems right now with AI in the corporate world, and in federal government right now where I'm at and one of the four is ethics.
Yeah. The reality is when you think about technology as a banner for applied science, for example, it's been with us since the dawn of time. AI is really just the next iteration of this technology landscape. And if you allow me to explain what I mean by that, when we move from one age, the Stone Age to the Iron Age, for example, we were driven there by technology. When man made tools, or when he created the wheel, or when he, whatever he did, technology has always moved us forward. And the human person, the human species, has always benefited. The real question now is that still the case with AI? We just don't know where it's going. And the speed at which it's evolving is also of some concern for us because it's moving so very quickly. And we're seeing, Troy, when the foundations for AI today is in machine language. And machine language, as you know, is built upon artificial neural networks. The ability of computers to learn and simulate and continually get better and have conversations and create content that was never there before. That is new. And that is going to have an implication on everybody. So as you're speaking about this from a church context, what you have to instill is the fact that even though it appears as if we're losing control, God is still in control.
Let me ask you a different question.
Does that make sense, though?
It does make sense. And, you and I have had, actually over dinner not too long ago, we talked about this topic, and you made a point. You're like, hey, Troy, God created stuff from nothing, and AI creates stuff from stuff.
That's right.
So I do remember.
God, so the theological position is that God creates ex nihilo, out of nothing and from nothing, and he creates everything. Gen AI is very different. It generates from that which is already there, right? And so we're anchored to the God who creates ex nihilo, out of nothing, and creates something, and he creates everything. And that's the Genesis story that we talk about. Gen AI, if you unplug the computer from the electrical outlet, it doesn't work. It's a big difference, right? Yeah. But nevertheless, we have been empowered by God in Genesis to be fruitful and multiply, to go forth and have dominion. And he never defined the limits of what dominion means. right? And we have been demonstrating dominion over knowledge, dominion over the earth, dominion over that which he has given us dominion over. So the authority we have is still delegated authority from God. And thus I think we can be comfortable with this. Now, that doesn't mean I'm entirely comfortable. It does cause me some concern as well, because I see the implications. But no one has ever been able to predict with absolute certainty where any technology goes. And if you speak to folks who have lost jobs as a result of technology, what you learn ultimately is that society somehow figures it out and move on. You made mention, though, of ethical concerns. And if you read the authoritative studies on this, there are some ethical concerns that obviously one has to be concerned about. And for example, the unequal or unequal distribution of wealth. There's always winners and there are always losers with technology. And Gen AI is creating, as you know, winners and losers. The concern we all have to then balance is if the losers outweigh the winners, we're going to have an imbalance in society. And that's something that not just the church needs to be concerned about, but governments and policymakers and the regulatory environment. Because if you leave it unchecked, it perhaps takes us to a place where we don't really want to go.
You and I had a discussion too on the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. When that imbalance gets, you can see that
the masses
rise, and
they topple the society.
Yeah.
And it's been a telling point in Western civilization that says we can't allow that tipping point to ever get to that point anymore. When the inequality becomes that obvious, everybody's at risk.
Don't you think, though, that AI attacks a different class? From my perspective, and I shared this with you after I was in Orlando with IBM. I walked away from there thinking, there's a new class that's the focus. It's digital workers. It's white collar. It's in the past, some of those jobs were like union workers, that manufacturers on a shop floor. People that planted, farm, and a lot of these technologies replace the blue collar. Yeah. And, the white collar folks now felt safe. And, something I thought was interesting too is in consulting industry and in digital worker industry is that, back in the 90s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, you and I were there. We watched a lot of jobs get moved offshore.
That's right.
And at that point, it was all about human labor arbitrage rates, much cheaper in Southeast Asia, India, Vietnam, et cetera, Philippines. And so we moved and we watched people that we really cared about. You probably watched your parishioners lose jobs with the bitterness, like, oh my God. And they, it was so bad. I remember watching a 60 Minutes and they had people on the show that had to train the person that was going to leave the country and take that job to another place. And that all happened, and people that argue I'll call it in economic warfare, of whether you're a globalist or focus more on the national or isolationist, is like from a globalist perspective, that was taking advantage of being a global economy and using the rate arbitrage.
Right? Yeah.
But I think now what they're looking at is taking that technology to those centers in the Eastern Asia or Far East, and basically applying where they basically could do it with as many people as they needed to because it was a lot cheaper. Now they're going to replace those types of jobs with technology, being able to apply accounts payable, pay receivables, do general ledger additions, vendor selection, all of the things that can happen in those outsourced centers. And so now that rate arbitrage or that labor arbitrage is now going to become human arbitrage.
That's correct.
And,
That's correct.
And that type of capability, potentially bringing the work back to the U.S. or to a centralized spot, but to nobody.
Yeah.
So
nobody.
Yeah. And so
but someone benefits, Troy, and this is where the line has to be carefully understood. You and I see this because we're technologists, and you're on the leading edge, I know, of a number of different things, right? So you see this and you're well ahead of it. But the fact of the matter is someone benefits, right? The corporations, stock prices grow. NVIDIA, as we all know, had a three-way split recently because its chip powers AI. But the benefit to the corporation is significant, but it doesn't filter down evenly to the masses. And that is the concern. Do we allow the technology to move in the direction where it creates an unequal distribution of wealth to the point where it destabilizes?
Yes.
And the ethical issue that we are dealing with is exactly that one. That is one of many, right? But the Gen AI issue, as you've so accurately stated, threatens anything that can be systematized through a process. So back in the 2000s, you and I recognized that anything that you could wrap a process around, you could outsource.
Yep.
And if you can outsource it, you can outsource it to anywhere in the world that you can outsource it to. Today, the issue isn't just outsourcing. It is that it is outsourcing plus the machine's ability to behave like a human person does. And the machine's ability to do that means the machine can now displace any number of persons. Now, let's talk about process and technology. And we can use examples that are fairly simple that everyone understands. How many restaurants do we go to nowadays? When you're flying, for example, in New York, I've done this many times, there are no human takers for the menu anymore.
Right.
When you walk through the airports, many of the booths are peopleless. Well, so already we're seeing that displacement, and it happens typically at the lowest level first. And what you're saying and what we're seeing is that we're no longer immune. Teachers aren't immune. Doctors aren't immune. White collar workers aren't immune. Nobody is. High paid consultants aren't immune. And the question then becomes, where does it stop? That's the ethical issue. Who is benefiting from this ultimately as we continue to deploy the technology to create more and more economic output at a lower and lower cost, but at the same time, it displaces more and more workers. And that's an ethical issue.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. One of the examples that I've come across recently is pretty big consulting leader made a comment that he had a really close client relationship, one of the biggest companies in the world. And, the cool thing about being in consulting, I'm in federal now, but, we were in the Fortune 500, and that's where you and I worked. We were at the top of companies. So it's like, you get calls sometimes at weird times, and it's like game on, like right now, we got to start doing something. Or I need to be able to initialize a team to help, and that's why consultants are always paid good money, especially back in the day. Is like that call, on top of doing the stuff we're getting paid to do, we're also kind of a triage. I need to ask you a question.
That's right. You were always available.
Yeah. I mean, and back in that day, I would get a call, and the next morning I'd be on my way to Munich. That's right. It was that important. But I think the thing, and we'll get back to the sermon in the church, but I think the thing, just to kind of set the final piece about AI and the fear, I guess, on the white collar side, this leader gave an example to a bunch of us, and he said, I got one of those calls, and right away, in consulting, they have what they call consulting assistants. They're it's like an AI, it's like a chat GBT for consultants. And all the consultancies, IBM is like way far ahead right now because they've got some of their own internal products. But these are things that you could kind of query and ask. And like if I was asking a staff member, like making that second call to somebody, but I was just doing my computer, and because I know how to perfectly prompt that question. Yeah. Whatever I just got to ask, that's what my skill is to decompose a problem into a framework and then start working it in multiple levels. So this guy said, hey, I got the question, I tried the technology, and he got the response back. And then he said, I want that information put in a table. Type that in. It got put into, I'd like that be put in a PowerPoint. He then called his whole team in and said, I'm going to send you kind of a draft of where I'm at. I need you guys to do some fact checking. He typed in, send this to my staff. It sent it to all of his staff and told them that they have till, first thing in the morning. Or actually, it was the same day. So you got the call at 3. It was like, I need this by this evening. Everybody went through, gave their checks. So it took him literally 8 minutes to do this query, get it set, format it, put it in a presentation, and give it to his staff. And an hour later, all the staff had validated and given their comments. He then clarified the prompt with their comments, redid the same thing in 2 or 3 minutes, and had the output. The thing that threw me off a little bit.
That is frightening.
No. But think about the power of this. Yeah. The thing that was, I'm a consultant and we got to make money. So I'm not trying to be holier than thou, but I would just say the thing that he did after that is he held that till the next day. He could have turned it in like within an hour to the client. And somebody said, well, why do you hold it? He's like, I can't show him that I'm that efficient. I mean, they need to know that there was a value to that. And that's just too fast to show value. So the client ended up, and this is a pretty important issue that had to be dealt with, that had real-time earnings per share impact, potentially news issue. And so he says, I wait. And he was almost, he was almost proud that he was, like he was almost giving us a lesson on, hey, this is going to be great, but we need to be able to continue to show our value. Yeah. So he waits till the next day about 11, 12 o'clock, calls the client, says, hey, I need to talk to you right away. It's always hard to get sometimes client time. They're like, come on in, let's do this. They did it, via video. And the client's like, oh my God, this is perfect. So stop that story there. So if you think about that, that would normally take 2 or 3 days easily.
2 or 3 days with perhaps a team of 7 or 8 or
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And this guy,
by the way, 2 or 3 days, a team of 7 or 8, all of whom are making $150 plus an hour.
That would be lighter. Right? Yeah, it would be
that
probably
would be
much more
on
the low
inexpensive
side. Yeah. These guys, especially if you're dealing at the top of the company.
And by the way, Troy, pardon the interruption. Sure. It would be also persons who've gone to school. Yeah. And they've earned potentially a master's degree in business, in finance, in accounting, and have labored to be where they are. Now, think of what that means in terms of how many layers of persons it slices from the economic chain and the long-term implication of that if you multiply that by all the companies that we work for. Yeah.
Well, it was funny. So I get home from that, and one of my sons, he works at one of the big firms. And he's in consulting, followed Dad through the process. And I'm having dinner with him and his girlfriend, and Betty. And I bring up this example. And before I even get into the example, he's like, Dad, you don't realize, you're out of touch. This is he's 27. I'm like, what do you mean I'm out of touch? He's like, AI is going to ruin the whole consulting industry. He goes, look, right now, you're using it as a way to effectively, using that premise, you could go bid a job for $100 and charge $100. But now that you have tools, you could get it done for $50 versus $80, So now it makes you much more profitable, so you can be more aggressive on your bid, so you'll go win more work. He said, but the bigger picture is that now, over time, you're not going to need all the staff, so consultants are going to lose their job. Yeah. And then eventually, they're having you, the partners of, all these big firms, you are the big guys, you're out selling to the tops of the government, the tops of the corporations. And eventually what you're trying to sell is the capability of asset-based consulting to the clients. Right. But he goes, Dad, when do you think it's going to be a time when the clients actually go, just give me the tool? Yeah. Then they don't need, because they could even prompt the question better than I could.
Because you've got to talk with them to get the business requirements, right?
So pretty soon all I'm doing is selling them the asset, and they have access to the tool, and they don't need me, they don't need my team, they don't need anybody else. But then he goes, then go one step further. I'm like, okay.
This is Ethan. He's pushing the conversation here.
Yeah, and he goes, so pretty soon that executive reports to a board. So do you think the board needs to have these high-priced executives? So, and eventually you could just kind of keep playing through. That's right. And, so kind of going back and making
but before you go there, Troy, what he drew you into is the bigger picture. Yeah. Right? When you look at anything on a micro scale, you can feel relaxed or comfortable about what the implications are until you put it on a macro scale. That's right. And that is indeed the conversation that we're having. When you look at this in a micro environment, if you were to think about this, for example, the assembly line affected just the manufacturing industry, and let's say cars as an example. AI, on the other hand, isn't localized or contained within any particular industry. It's touching everything. And thus, the point I made earlier when I said there are some ethical considerations that we have to consider, because to what end would be the question.
Well, I think his point was you're going to be out of a job too.
Yeah.
That's what he was telling me. Like,
And then what happens to the vast bulk of the world? The rich will always be rich. They're not impacted by this. They're not impacted by the machinations of AI. They don't earn a living. They have wealth that creates wealth.
Yeah.
But then the people who need to earn a living, who are no longer able to do so because the machine has replaced them, means we're now pushing into a society where there is literally two classes. The haves, literally, and the have not served the inability to have. And that is not going to be a pleasant place to be. And I think that's the ethical question, that's the moral dilemma, because the scripture doesn't tell you how to respond to this necessarily. And thus we have to invoke something else in addition to the biblical context, the government and regulations, and seeing a little bit further the big picture and what it means for the human species.
Can I ask you though, when going back to the sermon and now using the example I gave you an example where I lose my job, right? Potentially. When you're getting ready to do a sermon, what about the application of AI in church? Like, do you ever worry about that, or is that something that you would talk to the church about? Is like, because in a way, I mean, the pastors are white collar of, so that job, can kind of go through metamorphosis. Is that, do you try to personalize it to what it can mean to you, or do you see that?
I don't see the personalization of it within the context of losing a job within the church per se. Because at the end of the day, the relationships in a church are relational. They are people-based. Yeah. They're not machine-based. The relationship that God has with the people of God is God to us and us to each other. And the machines, or machines in general, were never intended to replace that. And so from that vantage point, there isn't that concern. The bigger concern that a pastor has would be the implications that it has to the parishioners in terms of their jobs. Obviously, if they're not stable in economic ways, nothing else becomes stable. Because you first have to make the human person, the physical human person, stable.
Got it.
We're not, we are spiritual beings, but we are spiritual beings in physical bodies. And thus, how the spiritual body operates within society, economically, socially, and otherwise, is crucial to the human person. And his or her happiness and his or her relationships and all the things that are critical to family life and society and so forth.
So I guess, Barry, kind of as we kind of draw down on the sermon, we're, let's say theoretically, we're going through a process. You're kind of talking this type of discussion out in your head. Do you ever come to a conclusion that the topic isn't ripe yet for the church? Like,
well, it's ripe, but from a different context.
Okay.
It's ripe from the context that there are parishioners who are going to be affected by this, if not today, tomorrow. And we can't put our heads in the sand and pretend as if it doesn't exist. But the triumphant outcome in a message would be, this is not the first time that technology has had negative implications on society. By the way, Troy, AI has positive implications as well. There is the displacement of jobs, and that is certainly negative. But you and I do know that the ability, for example, of artificial intelligence to fast path its way through biomedical engineering has tremendous positive implications. To find cures for diseases that heretofore we've never been able to really understand. Tremendous implications. One has to think then, because messages are hopeful by, you're either trying to send a message of warning, but oftentimes you are sending, you're lifting the congregation through the hope that is in the Word of God. And through belief and trust in God himself, right? We have to know that even though we don't know how it's going to end, we can trust the one who has the beginning from the end in his hands.
something that just kind of in your theme there of hope, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to have kind of put on the screen. There was a Wall Street Journal article that came out that talked about the ability for the baby boom, like in the population statistics, and some of the problems that we're coming to a crisis with being able to maintain our population, that it's potentially coming down. And in that article, when just like you, I end everything with hope. Like I want to be positive. I see too, just so that you don't.
And by the way, that is not a false sense of happiness,
Right?
But it's what enables you to face tomorrow,
Right?
Without jumping off a cliff.
Yeah. No, and I think that's right. I think for me, the AI and kind of how it works itself out, like you said, not only in medical and biomedical discoveries and a lot of different fast pathing of using technology the right way, but in that article, we've always heard, hey, the Earth's population is just going through the roof. It'll just continue, this multiplier effect. The reality is that that's based on data. It doesn't appear to be true.
That's right.
I know I have 3 boys from ages 27 to 38, and none of them have kids.
Yeah.
And so there's clearly something, where people are pausing, good or bad, doesn't matter. But if you look at that article, and I talk about my job maybe as a problem, or maybe other jobs or other white collar, but the reality is, like, the context of today, like specifically today, is unemployment's very low. And if you've ever, like right now trying to hire people, it's hard to find people.
That's right.
So, and business is continuing to grow. So where I think we find is a middle ground of we'll be able to utilize everybody
eventually,
because that there's not going to be enough population to maintain a capital path that we're on for 50, 100,000 years, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a way to potentially, you always say this when we're joking around outside of here, which is applied science kind of solves things like this.
That's right.
And maybe we are trying to solve a population problem too.
That's right. That's right. And it's an interesting point that you made, because Western Europe has the same problem with population growth. Japan, China
does too.
The same problem. So that's an absolutely important point. And I think I would like to anchor this, Troy, is that we have no idea what's in the future. There is some degree of predictive analytics that we can talk about, but that's based on data that is what it is at a point in time. But there's no absolute certainty of how it will evolve tomorrow. And if you look at the past and trust that it's a reliable predictor of the future, technology has always enabled us to advance appropriately. This has some concerns, and I do believe if we recognize that we can stop it, that's important, because the rate at which it now advances is geometric or logarithmic or some other scale that is not linear.
Right.
But we recognize that we're now moving into areas that we've never explored before.
That's right.
What sort of opportunities does that create? And so when you speak to the congregation about hope, they've got to hope in a tomorrow that they don't know, but trust that God has it in control.
That's awesome.
And you've got to trust that, because that enables you to carry on. And if you go to any people who have been subjugated in the past and you ask them, well, how did you survive yesterday in order to make it to today and tomorrow? And they'll tell you, we hope. Hope is the anchor for the soul. In other words, it keeps you firm and steadfast, and it prevents you from drifting. And at the end of the day, no matter what the circumstances are, you've got to instill hope in the congregation, because it keeps them settled in their faith and it keeps them constant in their trust. And ultimately, you've got to be human enough to say, I don't know what the answer is, but we trust one who does.
That is awesome, Barry. Well, before we break, I think this is going to be 2 episodes.
Are we done already?
Usually it's like midnight and we have to end. But on this one, hey,
so what people don't know, Troy, is that when you and I get on the phone, we talk for 2 hours.
Yeah, I know.
So trying to contain something within 30 minutes is challenging. So.
Well, what I was thinking, maybe if you wouldn't mind coming back, the other topic that I did want to get, now we've kind of set a table, and maybe it makes sense just to be kind of an additional part of this is, we've talked about AI and potential effects, and you've talked about the context of your church, or how would you approach some of the questions that I get are kind of science fiction questions, like on evolution.
And you're using evolution in a non-Darwinian sense or in a strict Darwinian sense? I think I know what you mean. Yeah. But when people hear that term, for example, when Christians hear the term, they automatically think, well, you've got to be either, if you believe in evolution to some degree, you've got to reject the creation narratives of Scripture or the creation doctrine. Let me put it that way. And that is not true. Because we know that there are aspects scientifically of evolution that is absolutely on. The question is whether or not we evolved from something else to where we are today. And the answer to that is no. Right. But we continue to evolve as people. And so I wanted to raise that Darwinian issue.
No, see, this is how it goes. Yeah. I think that's a great point too, because I'm not drawing the line picking between evolution and the creation theory. Okay. What I'm trying to do is if
you're using evolution as a general term.
It's a general term. Gotcha. And I would even throw in even in the last 100 years, we've been able to use prosthetics, hearing aids, in embedded technologies, and eventually even neural networks getting embedded in the brain. So over time, there'll be integration with artificial intelligence or some form of that. And I
know. And I'm thinking about this vocally because there's a natural selection theory that's embedded in Darwinism, but I don't think that's where you are. Right. And I think what I'm hearing you say is we have evolved to place technology in the human body at varying places, bionic arms. Prosthetic devices, hearing aids, pacemakers, all those things are technologies that have allowed the human being to evolve and live more fulfilled lives with all kinds of diseases. Right. And I think that's the point you're probably making. And where does it stop is the question.
Well, and like I said, I don't want to keep bringing stuff outside the show in, but I remember you and I having a discussion. You're like, Troy, that's the science fiction stuff, right?
Yeah, Frankenstein.
The Frankenstein stuff. So, but in the next show, if you wouldn't mind, come on back. That'd be awesome.
It is, Troy, it's always an honor. It's always a pleasure to dialogue with you on the things that we talk about in our private time. We don't purport to have the answers, but what we're doing is we're having just a frank conversation among brothers and men that I think could benefit others, and that scares us. Because I remember you and I, after we were talking the other night, we were like, well, since we're now sufficiently scared each other.
That was
right. Yeah. Because we were talking about all the implications of this, and some of which, it's not appropriate necessarily to speak about in a public company, but we know where this thing potentially goes. Yeah. But we recognize when we close the conversation that God is in control. Yeah. And we walked away knowing that.
Yeah. You're right, though. I remember that was late, and I said that, and I was thinking, Yeah.
So. Cool. Happy to come back whenever
Excellent.
that is.
Well, thank you, and hope everybody enjoyed the show today. And Barry, I look forward to having you back.
Absolutely.
Thank you, my friend.
It's my joy and pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.